Hello, Nick. How are you doing?
Record, good morning.
Yeah, good morning to you too. It's actually afternoon here. I don't know what you're up to, but I don't know. Ever since we started this podcast, it might be you. I'm just getting more and more exposure to social theory and institutional theory and all this sort of bullshit that
Whoa!
that I don't even like. And I don't know whether that's my fault or it's just you just bringing it up everywhere. Just to give you an example, I just found this blog post by Bob Sutton, who I follow on Twitter, and he has really he doesn't hold back. Like he has interesting things to say about lots of things.
So
But
Bob Sutton, he's the org
yeah,
guy at
exactly.
Stanford. Yeah.
Absolutely, right? So normally he does a lot about HR and org design and stuff like this. But I found this gem of a post where he takes the piss, sorry for my language, where he takes the piss out of a sociomateriality, one of our greats, Wanda Olikovsky, wonderful paper. And he calls it jargon monoxide. And he writes literally, I hope the authors can find a simple word or two to explain what they mean. And I thought that was just brilliant because that's how I feel sometimes about these things. They're very complex and eloquent and erudite and really, this like I think it's just super abstract stuff that's just really complicated expressed to say a very, very simple thing. So I thought we'd talk about this.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Well, and in that same article, Bob Sutton earlier says mimetic isomorphism, right, is really just copying other organizations,
And
right?
it's
And it is. And he's like, so yeah, Bob is like, why do we use these big words like mimetic isomorphism when we just mean copying? Why do we use sociomateriality when, well, I'm not sure what we mean there, but we could talk about it a little bit. But it's like, technologies get their meaning in social situations, right? I don't know what a buzzier word would be for sociomateriality, but
Yeah, but I mean, first of all, we got to say like this is not an attribute of social theory, social materiality per se, right? I was just reminded that at the moment I'm working with some of my doctoral students around inductive work, theorizing
mm-hmm.
from case study data, and of course, you know what we're doing. We're building Gioia data structures, and we're
Oh,
coming up with
geez.
three mechanisms, never four, never two, just
Yeah.
always three, right? Of course, and then of
Well,
course we give them labels, right?
yeah.
All these mechanisms, the concepts, and they have labels, and by some weird implicit social norm, it's always a very complicated term with a very complicated qualifier.
Yeah.
So I give you one
Yeah.
example, true story. Yeah, so we got this one thing, and we talk about digitalization, putting something into a digital version, and we call it attuned morphing. Attuned morphing. What we mean is it changes. And that's
But
what
it's
we do.
attuned
That's
to
what we do
something.
all the time. We
Yeah.
find a very eloquent sounding word to mean something very
It
simple.
changes in a particular way, right? It's attuned. Yeah.
Yeah, of course. It's okay. It's like sort of, it's change that they thought about.
Well, all right. So what we're talking about today, I guess, is two things: social theory and jargon. So let's start with the jargon, and this is a tough thing with academics because, like that woman, I forget her name, but at UPenn, she wrote Grit, the stuff
Yeah, yeah.
about grit. You know who I'm talking about? I can't. We'll find her and put it in the show notes. But apparently, her construct of grit overlaps dramatically with like one of the big five personality traits, conscientiousness or something. But since she used the term grit and it captured the popular imagination, she became famous. Right now, grit is fine, and I think it's cool, and I like the word grit. I think grit, is kind of evocative and it's quick, and we can grab it and we can run with it, and we understand what it means. That's why it was popular. Is it jargon? Was it unnecessary? Sure. I have people that do organizational behavior stuff in my school that are like, yeah, how do you get famous on rewording
Yeah.
conscientiousness and calling it fancier and
And
getting an
you can
academic
apply
career?
this to, I don't know much about the OB literature, right? But if you apply the same type of thinking to IS, I think you can easily
Mhm.
construct a folk theory, right? So the folk theory would be that all of our journals, for a reason that we discussed at length in this podcast, is sort of like we look for these theoretical contributions and probably as a way to establish the legitimacy of the field and its journals and so forth, right? So
Yeah.
theoretical contributions are all that matters. How do you build theoretical contributions? Well, the most obvious one is to build new theory. What are new theories? They're new concepts. Some of them are connected, but really it's about new concept. Then what's a concept? It's a word. It's a term. And what's a new concept? What's going to be a new term? So over time, of course, we're looking for more and more new words, roughly, for things that we called, and explained in different ways before. Because what else are you going to do? If you're looking for new, novel, substantive, original theoretical contributions, we really mean we want to invent a whole bunch of new terms that we can use. Right. So it's no wonder that someone comes up and says it's about grit. And it's not even jargony in a way, because grit is something that real people, they use that word. Yeah. But someone has grit.
And if you look at a lot of the ones that are really successful, so dynamic capabilities, right? That has a lot of evocative, to people who aren't into, and maybe before dynamic capabilities, we had meta routines and various other kind of more jargony words. But then the buzzword that ended up maybe, what else? Absorptive capacity is kind of buzzwordy, but it seems to have succeeded.
Disruptive innovation.
You could have just said learning potential or something.
Disruptive innovation is evocative.
Yeah. Exploration exploitation is like perfect because it can be used in both.
I think that's a natural thing of that academics do, right? We invent new vocabularies to talk about things, and in a way that's a good thing. So because every now and then we want to highlight a particular nuance, so we want to maybe say that conscientiousness is not quite the same as grit, because grit is this slightly different thing or whatever, right? So I don't know, but so in a way that's not a bad thing that we're doing. But I would go as far in saying that everything that's connected to social theory, to tie it back to this, is particularly prone to that. Like they just take us to this extra level of eloquence, of super obscure terminology that is really detached, and that's not even comparable to grit, because grit would say, like, I can talk to my mother about grit, and she was like, oh yeah, I know what grit means, but I can't talk to her about mimetic isomorphism. No one has any idea of what that's supposed to mean other than reading the paper.
Well, yeah, no, you're absolutely right. But all right. So in the defense, because I come from a social theoretic background, my training is there, and that's what I love to read and think about and write. Right. So it's like, here you're hitting something that to me is super important. Now, I agree with you. I'm not pretending for a minute that social theorists are clearly their ideas are clearly evident to anyone. No, I think that it's informed by sociology. And I think the two big kind of organizational, social, theoretical perspectives are going to be sociology and economics right now. And I think economics, and I have this theory about what is academia. And I think academia is not necessarily brilliant people. We have brilliant people among academics, but my theory has always been that the difference between an academic and a non-academic is 4 years. That's about it, right? So we have the whole gamut, just like in the, I worked for a number of years before I came to get my PhD. And there were brilliant people in industry. There were not so brilliant people in industry. There were hardworking people in industry. There were not so hardworking people. I come to academia, I see the same situation. We maybe have a larger percentage of smart people, but not that much smarter, actually. In industry, I was in tech. Most people are pretty smart. As a matter of fact, I'd say a lot of the people without PhDs that I knew should have had them, because they were way smarter than most professors I know, right? So are we the intellectual elite? No, we're not. So what do we have to do? We have to protect ourselves from scrutiny from those who are in the outset, right? So how do we do that? Well, economists do it with econometrics or analytical modeling. Unless you are in the game, right? You cannot criticize the game, right? Your econometric analysis, yes, I can give you the final regression coefficient. I can tell you what I found. But as far as analyzing my paper, you can't do it unless you're an econometrician or an analytical modeler, right? That's how econ kind of does it. The way sociology does it is with the scaffolding of their theoretical basis, right? And are you a structuration person, a Bourdieu or a Giddens structuration? If so, those are different, and there are nuances between the two that matter. Are you a critical realist? If so, that matters because it's going to depart from Bourdieu and Giddens. Are you an actor network? Then you're going to, and each of these has their own vocabulary, their own scaffolding, their own little conversation that protects them from scrutiny of really smart outsiders. I think
Exactly.
that's
So,
the
and that's
cynical
what
answer.
I wanna ask you about this. So you just mentioned some of these big social theory guys. You know, one of them, Bruno Latour, he just recently passed away, right? And there was a
Yeah.
lot of eulogies and that sort of stuff. So you may also remember we had Kathy Urquhart on, and she
Yeah.
made this comment in passing saying, well, you know, the sociologists are so much better at theorizing than we are. And my
Yeah.
immediate knee-jerk reaction is like, why do we assume that's true? We're like, I
Yeah.
don't see any evidence of this. I see that they do a lot of theorizing, and I see that we put a lot of status to some of the individuals that came up with these, you know, some of these theories, like Latour, like Bourdieu, and so forth, or Schatzky, or, you know, anyone else. But I don't know whether inherently I find their theory so much better than anything else than I've seen somewhere else. So why is that? Why do we think that the sociologists are better in theorizing than, let's say, IS people?
Well, it depends, I guess, what you mean by theorizing. But I ask people, and remember, I argued with her a little bit. I'm like, they ignore so many parts of the world, like technology, right? Most sociologists. But I'm a user of sociology. I'm not a sociologist. I can't claim to argue with them. But I've read pretty deeply, I guess, in some of the sociology literature. And here's what happens, right? So I don't think they're intending to protect themselves from external scrutiny. I think what happens is they're trying. So we mentioned Bourdieu, right? And he's done a number of things, but let's just get at one of his big works. He has this idea, this distinction idea. And his argument is that tastes in France are conditioned by your social class, right? And this is a Max Weber argument. And what he did was really built it into his worldview of how people are playing these different games in the world. That might be one way of thinking about Bourdieu, right? They're playing these different games. And when you're in the game, if you're a rich person, you'll like caviar because you're in the game of art and being rich and whatever. And then you taste caviar and the actual taste buds in your mouth appreciate it. If you're a poor person, and you're going to the soccer pitch and you're going to the right and someone gives you caviar, your taste buds will not like it, right? And it's less about what your taste is, it's more about your social context. So his big argument was unpacking how social context is actually reflected in taste, and then taste reinforces the social context. Things like your taste in food, for example, right? So his idea of distinction is that it's not like some external party is forcing you to be in your caste or whatever, your class, your game. You're actually just playing your game, and it's perfectly natural, right? So that's one of the structurational arguments. Now, I just said that, but if someone who's actually a Bourdieu scholar is listening, they're probably going crazy because I oversimplified Bourdieu for the purposes of talking to him outside, right? And that's the issue with a lot of these grand theories, is that the any particular implication might be trivial, but since you unpack it, or since you put it in the entire area, the scaffolding of their worldview, that it gives it the power, right? I can say things about, if I were using all of Bourdieu's dynamics, I could say things about like symbolic violence and how they power relations are really important in the game and between the games, and how people move from one game to another. And he unpacked all of this from a conceptual standpoint, right? And I think that's valuable, and I think it's very good. The problem is, anybody uses Bourdieu, you're not going to come in out of the blue and just grab all of his theoretical scaffolding and be able to contribute in any way to what Bourdieu said, right?
So I have no issue with what you said. Like, I agree with you, right? So, but I still think, so to me, the difference is this. So if you're a sociologist, your phenomenon and your abstraction level is just on a different level than what we do as IS people, for example, right? Sociologists, they look at big social issues such as, status and distinction and behavior, and trying to explain these sorts of things. So by and large, they're really more general problems, cross-sectional big problems, rather than substantive little things, which is what most of the time we do. How do we use blockchain for financial transaction in a developing country? That's an IS topic.
Yeah, but now let's hear what you just said about the developing country. How do you use it? Well, you just said blockchain, right? So you brought up the exact. So let me tell you what happened to me in my PhD journey, right? I was at Case. I was reading Bourdieu. I was reading Giddens actually at the time, and there's a lot of structure, agency, domination, legitimation, signification. These, and I'm just like, all right, this is all bullshit. It's all so vague, and I don't really know. I don't even know what structure means, and I've read the whole book now a couple times, and that's when I came across institutional theory. And to me, institutional theory was the practical way of getting at this sociological stuff without having to get all the baggage of all. And it's because an institution is something you can point to. What is an institution? One way to think about it is it's a social structure with a name.
Yeah.
The moment you give something social a name, it's an institution, whether it's a handshake, whether it's the U.S. government, whatever. And that,
I agree with you there.
by the way, from Berger and Luckman, they get that from there. They call it objectivation, which again is a significant. It's a jargon, right? Objectivation or whatever Berger.
Yeah, but really they mean that you take something and by giving it such a name, you make it a concrete thing. Sort of like you make it tangible, you make it material.
An object in its own right.
Think about the government. To me, you can think of it as a thing that I can touch, even though you can't. Whereas a structure is just super abstract. So, by the way, that's not the point that I wanted to make. So, if we say,
no, I want to get back to blockchain because you brought up the most hilarious freaking example. Because you, in the example you brought up, and I had to give the scaffolding to be able to say what I wanted to say to blockchain, right? In the developing world, what is the issue? What is blockchain? Blockchain is an institutional arrangement, right? The developing world is missing institutions. It's missing government agencies. The most important thing about the question you just brought up was not the technology. It was the institutional context, right? And it's like you're acting like, oh, the practical stuff. Well, except the practical stuff, Wrecker, is you would die for your country. You would die for your marriage.
I probably wouldn't.
Right? And your family. All right, maybe not your country.
Well, but why?
Yes, you would. So you're but these are social constructs. This is not a thing. It's not part of you. It's something you arrange socially for yourself to the point where it's the most important thing in your life, right? The institutions are the most important elements of human interactions, and to not understand them, right? Yeah.
So, again, I don't disagree. The point that I wanted to make was a little bit, okay, we operate on different levels of abstraction in the way that I thought, look, we got Modaro, we look at one specific, let's say institution, one specific social element, in one specific region and so forth. That's what we usually do. And the sociologists, they look at big social issues like power and control and classes and status and stuff like that. So that's fine. But if you look across that, why do we always think that whatever they theorize, the explanations they offer on their more high-level, broader phenomenon, why are they inherently better? Because what I see a lot is that what IS people do is they turn to these big grand theories. We even call them grand theories. Why do we call them grand? And they look to apply them to their little thing here based on that sort of inherent assumption that these are somehow better.
Well, I don't know about better. Better is hard, but they're elaborated. Right. They already have.
I mean, are they, in our field, we can look at a body of work, maybe not by one person, but, there are sometimes bodies of work on how certain classes of phenomena, how they really work. I don't know. Think everything Isaac Bembazar has done over 30 years in e-commerce and agents and stuff like that. I don't know. That's a body of work. And, we know a lot about that. Why is that, not as elaborate and, let's say, Bourdieu's 30 years about distinction in practices and fields and stuff like that?
Well, all right. So, all you're saying is one is a grand theory and one's kind of a mid-range theory. I think
I think most people would say there's a quality difference between the two. And that's what I want to argue with. Like Kathy, we tend to assume that they're better theories. Why? They make theories, we make theories, they're on different levels, they're about different phenomena, but I've yet to see something that is in the quality of the theory itself that would say, that's a better theory.
Well, so, you're going to pull out the old American pragmatist in me. I'm not going to, and again, pragmatist, I'm not a relativist. I don't think this shit people are publishing, I'm sure you've heard of this guy, doing an auto ethnography on masturbation.
Yeah,
right? And nonsense, right? This is stuff to get people to look at you that is not strong scholarship, right? The moment you have to resort to describing masturbation or putting a penis in a paper in order to get people to read it, you shouldn't. Or remember, there was the old one who said, fuck nuance. There was a guy, I think it was like Duke or UNC, fuck nuance, right? No one's going to read this guy's paper, but he puts the F word in his title. To me, that's not scholarship. There are a lot of kind of, and I like critical theory, the good stuff, but there's a lot of this kind of amateurish, sensationalist
but what
stuff
you're doing the
that
same
I don't
thing.
think is scholarship.
But you're doing the same thing. You're just saying this is of better or higher
No,
quality
I'm
than
not.
something
I'm
else.
simply pointing out I'm not a relativist. A
Well,
relativist would look at it and say, well, that one's better, this one's not,
but
and
didn't
let
you
people
just do
have their
that?
own
You
view.
just said that masturbation or the
No, that's low quality. It's shit. All right, let me finish. Don't quit trying to.
all right,
This is my point. The big problem is when you take a pragmatist argument, people will immediately accuse you of relativism and say, well, they're all good. It's just one's good for one, the other's good for the other. That's where the pragmatist argument goes. But I do want to say the difference between a pragmatist argument and a relativist argument. The relativist argument would be like, it's all good, let anybody do what they want. And I can't go that way because I think there is some shit, and we can call the shit when we see it. And I just named to you some of the examples
way,
of
which
shit
is
that
what
I've
Bob
seen.
Sutton does a lot on Twitter as
Yeah.
well. He calls that
Yeah.
bullshit.
So there is plain old bad scholarship and there is plain old bullshit, right? Number one. So I'm not a relativist. Now, of the quality research, of which I'd put probably most sociology, most IS research is quality in its game. Very little. These are smart people with goodwill doing the best they can to have an idea and move the conversation forward, right? So the question is IS better than sociology? That seems to be the argument you want to make. And I'd be like, well, come on, better. What does that mean? Is IS better for an IT manager to look at our implementation studies than sociological theory? Absolutely. Is sociological theory better so again, the pragmatist, what's your goal? If your goal as a sociologist is to explain status in a society, well, then IS research doesn't help you very much, right? Maybe it does a little. Maybe we can help bring technology in, but we don't help a whole lot. You're right. It's what's your goal? What's your goal? What's the purpose? And then different theories have different values.
I'm fully with that, right? So, and that I didn't mean to say that we're necessarily better. I just was objecting to the sort of implicit viewpoint that we're necessarily worse, And it's sort of again piggybacking on what Kathy said is this idea of like, well, don't we have something to say about socio-technical arrangement in more general, in more abstract, in grander ways? Well, and I think, that would be a good ambition. And I think this ambition is being halted by us always assuming that we are some sort of lower level.
No, I'll tell you the difference.
Not as good or whatever else. And as long as we keep on thinking that, we're never going to tackle, we're never going to come up with a better idea than sociomateriality. Because do I believe that's the best idea? Nah. That's the best idea so far, apparently.
We have to bring Kathy back. I'm going to channel her right now. But this is what I would say is that a sociologist, let's say if she was saying they're better at theorizing, I would argue it's because they're better at reading. All right. As far as I know, sociologists have to have a book when they graduate. So they finish with a book.
The same here, at least in Europe.
Yeah. So we usually have 3 to 5 papers anymore, right? But because that's the name of our game, we want to do papers. In sociology, you're supposed to finish your PhD with a book. In order to have a book, you need a deep exploration, and they also don't let each other not read. You mentioned Goya at the beginning of this. Every freaking Goya paper I see is recreating some mechanisms that already exist in the literature and under some different name. Okay, because people don't read, because they don't know what the literature has already said, they think what they're coming up with is new. In sociology, everyone reads, and you're either going to be a Giddens person or a Bourdieu or an Ant or whoever, and then you extend that work or apply that work or find something, and you do some little dotting the I, crossing the T, right? Or an institutional. Right now in organizational research, institutionalism is taken over, right? But they're not going to let you publish a Goya thing where you come up with 3 things in an institutional context, in one of the right? They'll force you to actually read. Well, look, someone already said similar. You got to situate yourself in the.
My explanation for that is not a justification, just an explanation. It's sort of, in this fast moving pace, we are concerned with socio-technical arrangement where the technology changes really rapidly, really fast. In trying to keep up with that, we literally don't have the time to read 50 years of literature on the social aspect, which by and large, that changes as well, but it changes at a different pace. So in a way, maybe you could say that it's a little bit simpler for sociologists because, you read the 4 or 5 big books that they used to write and it got you covered for 50 years of research. In IS, it's very impossible. At the moment, I'm thinking new students, they should really go and reread some of the classic IS from the 90s and 2000s to understand what we're doing now and how that has evolved. No one does that. Like now, the new generation, they don't read TAM anymore. and they don't read.
Well, they shouldn't.
Yeah, they should not, or they should. I think
No,
they should.
there's not.
I
What are
think
they going to get
should.
by TAM? The adoption of technology is no longer an issue, right? What is that our
It's
issue that
not,
we're
but
worried
I
about?
think it's important to understand the genealogy and the evolution of the field.
Why?
I don't
Why?
know.
See, I don't know. I think
As a
this is
romantic of the field, I want people to remember this. Like, otherwise, in 10 years, everyone will have forgotten the first 50 years. Why we are here is a function of what we've done in the past, no?
Well, I think if you're interested in adoption, then yes, you should read what people have written in adoption.
But if you're not interested in adoption,
if you're not interested in adoption, you should read one paper in TAM, and now you know all the papers in TAM. You know, it's not like you have to. You know, I don't know. I think that I'm not a partisan in a sense to the IS field. What I am is a partisan as someone who wants to study digital technologies, right?
It's funny because I'm more of a partisan then, because I think like I'm, I like the field, and I don't know, try to uphold it and trying to defend it against critics. And I think, we're doing a better job than many inside the field even think. So I guess that's more of a partisan kind of attitude.
Yeah. And then I look at it and I think, all right, so, and maybe this is unappreciative of me because the IS field has treated me really well and I've thrived here and I love a lot of the people in the scholarship and everything. But to me, I think that the field itself doesn't have the impact outside of the field that it could. Right.
Well, I agree.
And it's like other people are not reading our stuff. And our people are very happy in our little bubble.
And I think it's because of us, because we don't have the confidence or the ambition or necessarily the skills, because we're always trying to defend. We never went outside and said, like, we got something that is of interest to you. You should listen to me. That's a question of attitude and confidence that, you go out and go to the management or to the sociologist for that matter and say, like, I know you, Bourdieu. I've read Bourdieu too. I have something to contribute here. Instead of shying away and saying, like, oh my God, you're so much better than me. That's exactly what I mean, right?
Yeah. And if we did, then we'd have to get into their literature. And like you said, there's only a few books to read, but it's not like in institutional theory, right? Which is where I like to read, depending on where you are. Like institutional logics, back when I got my PhD, was fairly new. There were a handful of papers, and now it's like there are 100 institutional logics, good ones, good papers each year. Just parsing little issues within logics and different case contexts. And it's like, that is not grand theory that they're doing in the organizational sociology, right? They're doing they're dotting the I's, crossing the T's on
mid-range.
institutional logics.
Mid-range theorizing.
Right. They're focusing on, say, identity, logics and identity, materiality, logics, and now they're part the very little. So these grand things that we're talking about, I don't see people there doing it either. But everybody has read all of that's trying to do these things, right? And there's so much coming out. You have to be in that game if you're going to do it. And as we've talked about in previous podcasts, we like to play with the technology. Now with that said, here's where I agree with you that the whole idea of actually paying attention to, like, look at us. You're in Germany. I'm in the US. We're right now communicating through Zoom, right? We've had these issues with our microphones where I'm trying to get you to get your mouth closer to the microphone so people hear you. And right, there's a physicality, there's materiality, there's the elephant in this room. The fact that you and I are such good friends is only because of the technology. We've seen each other in person, 4 times now? Or I don't know. Yeah.
Total probably 4 times. Yeah. That's right.
But we're on the Zoom with each other. At least we now have research projects. We have all this. We're on Zoom once a week or more with each other, right? We're hanging out. You're one of the people. There's my wife, and then there's Wrecker, right? So at this point, right, it's because of technology. To not theorize technology as such an incredible and element of our social arrangements is crazy. And if you go look at sociology or organizational social theory, they're not. They ignore, or they say they're going to study materiality, and what they really are studying is what they call material practices, which is how people do
that's
things.
Exactly what I mean. Like, if I look at what the people, now that every other field is also looking at technology, and they realize that they can't ignore it, and they're bringing it into their theorizing. And I'm thinking concretely about org science stuff, org studies, org theory, management, and a little bit even ASQ type of stuff. And I read their things and I think, look, we can theorize with the best of them. A lot of that stuff is really not very impressive to me. Like we remember we wrote this Managing AI special issue editorial, and we did a lot of literature review, especially you and me. You know, we read a lot of these things, and a lot of that was super unimpressive. All that stuff that was in AMR about conjoined agencies, really, like, you know, an IS person would whip that up in 2 days. Horrible thing to say, I know, but you know, it's really not all that impressive. So I think about thinking, how can we conceptualize the technology, and about how that implicates the linkages to social. I think we can handle that with the best of them. Like, I don't think that Bruno Latour can necessarily do it better than Nick Barrett and Jan Recker in 2022. You know, we're probably not on that level of scholarship. We certainly don't have that impact and not that legacy and so forth. I get all that, but like, in principle, inherently, I don't see why we'll be any worse. We don't do that, right? So I think it's more of an issue that we don't do that. We don't even attempt it. And also, let's assume we would do that. We would have all these institutional barriers around. It would be really difficult to get that published, to get reviewers for it and stuff like that. Just a little story on that. It's not really connected to social theory, but it's a good example. So you may not, like, I've done a few theory-only papers over the last 5-6 years, right? And still have a few in development. And we just got knocked back in late-stage rejection on some of them. And the feedback from some of the reviews was, you know, here's a new theory. It's our theory. It's our idea. No, it's not deductive from some higher level theory. It's just us theorizing about stuff. Yeah. And a lot of the feedback we always get is sort of, wow, you really need this overarching coherent theoretical frame, like some other better theory on top of it that would justify and legitimize our ideas. So what happens is, one of my co-authors literally this morning said, like, hey guys, I looked around, so I think we can use complex adaptive systems. You know, one of these grand theories that applies to everything and nothing. And can you overlay that? Of course you can. Yeah, like, of course, everything is a complex adaptive system. Everything is an actor network, for that matter, right? Of course you can. And I said, like, look, I'm pushing back on this. Like, why would we do that? There's not a single unique new insight that we get from overlaying this other language on top of it. It's really just bullshit that we throw on top for some sort of social reason, a legitimization reason, because some reviewer thinks for some other reason that he can better defend accepting the paper that way or something. But inherently, there's no good reason. There's not really a substantive reason why you would do that. And that's still a bit of the practice, that people struggle with evaluating your ideas unless they can check whether or not you faithfully applied someone else's idea.
No, and I get it. But all right. So in defense of it, so first of all, I agree with you that if we are stifling a lot of interesting stuff, and it's because of this publisher perish thing, that it's so important to get published in top journals, that everybody's sending all kinds of shit to top journals. So, and you're also sending these brilliant works that you've spent years focusing on. Well, you're a reviewer. You don't know the difference between shit and a brilliant work because you're not in that game, or you're just marginally in that game. And then you'll be like, hey, I follow the formula, right? You get them out. I think the publisher perish issue is really at the root of a lot of this. I also think we should be, you know, I don't know. We should have another episode where we think about how to change the process, right? But as far as this one goes, so exactly what you're saying, I get it, right? That do I need the scaffolding? Well, you might, if people have already said it. Like you just said with augmentation or whatever. If people are already talking in socio-technical systems about humans and technology augmenting each other in different configurations, right? Should we be publishing something that doesn't at least address that? And that's what I'm a little bummed out about, actually, about sociomateriality, is that I understand the difference, right? Socio-technical systems took an explicitly systems view of the world, right? Inputs, outputs, system, whatever. And those systems involved humans and technologies, right? That was the Tavistock Institute. That was the 1950s. And to me, that was the core of our field. And actually, I
agree.
Supratik, who's the new ISR editor-in-chief, right? He has that paper where he talks about that being the axis of cohesion in the field. And I like that. Me too. And I think sociomateriality, I understand, I guess, why Vanda and Susan did that, right? Because they wanted to depart from socio, and they wanted to remind social theorists that there's this material element, and that it's not like social exists without its material underpinnings, and the two are, they argue, ontologically inseparable. So I get the reason they were doing that, but with just a couple extra moves, they could have adapted socio-technical to this, I think. And I'm sure they have good reasons for not doing it, but I feel like the socio-technical was the core of our field, and we were the only field that took socio-technical and still take. And then by kind of pivoting to the socio-material idea, which I would argue sociomaterial is a type of sociotechnical, right? Sociotechnical systems might be one, sociomaterial might be another. It's paying attention to both the technology and social context, right? And I realize a sociomaterial zealot might look at me and go, "Oh, but you can't separate them," and they'll have some issues with me. But I think that it was a miscalculation in terms of if you want our field to impact other fields, because then people could look back at various ways of conceiving of socio-technical.
I think on most parts I would agree. Like if I introduce bachelor master students to IS, I always introduce it as a socio-technical field. That's also my way of distinguishing from other fields, including sociology and even the engineering disciplines. I think it's super useful. Also, very much like that Supra paper. Just look, this is the roots, this is what we're doing. And of course, we're not having equal balance to all of these different elements. It's sort of expected. I will say this about sociomateriality. So I have a huge issue with this ontological inseparability argument. I'm not too deep into it. So people will, people that know much more about it will probably take offense of what I'm going to say. But it looks to me just analytically sort of like they didn't want to go deeper.
No, it's in here. Here's the problem when you make any ontological claim, you're full of shit, basically. This is why, again, we American pragmatists just avoid ontological arguments because there's no answer to them. Yeah. But what they're saying is that the way I was very much against it. I mean, I thought sociomaterial was, when I was getting my PhD and those papers came out, I was like, what is this? This is nonsense. I was very emotionally against it. But then I settled down over time. And the thing that I was against was that ontological inseparability, because it was so obvious that here's a social context and here's a technology, and I can think about them differently, right? So, exactly. So like Leonardi and others said, it's analytic separability, right? But I guess the point is this: the thing that I came and it was actually as I got more into institutionalism that I started realizing, okay, I get this, right? So let me ask you this: I put a helmet on the table, right? A helmet, and that helmet is just sitting there. It's green. Right. And then I put whatever, the German flag on it and maybe a little camouflage and whatever. And there's that, all of a sudden you're like, that's a military helmet. That's right. Exactly what I just and thought. Then you start thinking about the now that doesn't mean there's only one way to use it. But the only way this helmet exists is with the army. It's with the practices of the army. It's with shooting so that you protect your head from the army. Right. And the army doesn't exist without the guns, the tanks. As a matter of fact, the shape of the army before we had gunpowder was swords, right? There was the whatever Bronze Age, Iron Age, right? So the materiality, the social entity doesn't exist without its materiality. The materiality has no meaning. It doesn't really exist. It won't be made without the social context, right? That helmet and that army are inseparable. Gunpowder and army, the tank and the army are inseparable. Our current conception of the army requires both, right? We can't just talk about the social side.
I get that, and I get that, but a good socio-technical person would always keep both perspective and look at both of them. So that's why I think the socio-material is it inseparable? No, I can still look at the helmet. I can still look
again. It depends what you mean by inseparable.
Exactly.
If inseparable to you means I can't conceive of them separately, well, then clearly it's not inseparable. If inseparable to you means one can't get meaning, you can't think of one, it wouldn't have its form without the other, then they're not inseparable.
But I will say this, so, okay, ontologically, fine, don't fully agree with this, but as you said, what's the point in arguing? I see it exactly the same way. I never knew this was a particularly pragmatist position, but I fully agree. I usually don't even try to get into this argument because what's the point? It's just different viewpoints. But I will say this, what I love about this, especially, Susan has done this a lot in other works as well, that's great forms of theorize. It's a nice, different new idea. I like the fact that someone goes out there and publishes these types of work, even though other people might not even agree with this. So, but if you take Wanda and Susan out of it, who else does that?
Here's the thing: what you just said with your previous paper is, and the reviewer's probably bad, and the editors are bad, and they're saying you need some overarching theory, right? What I suspect is that you're not engaging in a research conversation. Whereas Wanda and Susan were indeed engaging in a research conversation. They were looking at people studying social stuff, and they're saying, look, you got to pay attention to the material. Social doesn't exist without the material. And they're making that argument, right, to those people. You're making an argument for yourself. You're like, hey, here's this great idea. You're throwing it out there like a sausage on the table. Someone eat my sausage. No, no one's going to eat your sausage unless you tell us what's in it. Put it in a bun or whatever. Put
and
some
of course, what other people have said
mustard.
about similar sausages in the past. So I think I agree partially with you. So you don't know how we made this argument, right? So like, okay, have we attended to the conversation well enough? Apparently not, clearly, right? But I will say, I wanted to say this as well, as sort of as a thing I really like about some of the social theories, and your good friend Habermas and people like this. And what I find striking is we all talk about contributing to a conversation, but the way that they do it is very differently. I think a lot of them really go and say, like, here is what one particular scholar has said. Like, it's really people-centric in a way, right? So it goes like, look, Bourdieu argued this and this and this and this and this, right? So they really go to a person and a particular thing they said, and then converts around this. That's not what we do. No. Normally, when we engage in a conversation, we go a little bit like concept-centric, or sometimes even paper-centric, or even sometimes method or data-centric. That's sort of like, we have seen studies that have shown blah, and that's how we engage with the conversation. And they do this very, very differently, right? And I think one of the advantages of doing it their way, the social theorist way, it becomes very clear that if you have read widely and deeply, and if you have really thought about that conversation, that clearly shows, because otherwise I can't actually write that way.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So I think that's
or
something
no
that we could actually learn in our field. We could do this better and move more to a people-centric way of engaging with the literature. Yeah. Because
it's got to be a conversation.
Is really that you go in and take a particular argument that some particular person made in a particular paper and deconstruct it and argue with it. Like a real conversation, right?
So, let me give you a couple of examples, right? The first could be, so most of what I write, like when I used institutional theory, is about enterprise systems. And just like your blockchain in the developing world, when I see that, I saw an institutional context that whatever any individual is doing doesn't really matter as much as how the institutions are playing out in that developing country, right? So that's how I see enterprise systems. To me, TAM was never useful in thinking about enterprise systems because how a particular person adopts is less important, for my goals than for changing the organization than what's happening with the organization overall, right? And why? What are the patterns? What are the more general patterns that are going to impact the organization? If one person doesn't adopt, which in my dissertation, they didn't actually. A lot of people didn't, right? They would circumvent and whatever. That became less important, right? So what are the patterns? What are the general patterns, the routines, the org level outcomes, right? When I was trying to figure that out, and then someone pointed me to institutional theory and this idea of decoupling, right? Again, maybe it's a buzzword, whatever, but it explained what I was seeing beautifully. So I was able to use that. And then made some arguments around loose coupling and whatever else in my dissertation. But I needed that word to describe what I was seeing. And then I built my contributions on that word, right? So I think that the formula for us, right, when you say if you're phenomenon driven, which I would say that a lot of my work is, some of my work now is getting more conceptually driven. So I'm actually trying to extend a conversation. Okay. Those are harder. All right, where I'm trying to extend, say, the institutional logics and, technology conversation in a particular way. That's much harder when you're trying to extend a theoretical conversation with just theory without any particular phenomenon in mind. It's much easier with a phenomenon. The thing you run into with a phenomenon is that everyone else has said everything already, right? When I say I'm studying, say, ratings, online ratings, right? So I want to say, where are we with online ratings? I go do a good literature review. Yeah, people have studied a heck of a lot about online ratings, and I need to get my little addition to that, right? So that's harder. Enterprise systems, pick the phenomenon. Blockchain at this point, what is it about the phenomenon that people have written about blockchain now for 5 years, 6 years? In IS research, and it's like, all right, so what is it that they're not saying? You could, and that's the tough part, and that's where sometimes conceptual, kind of using the conceptual schema from social theory from, right, helps you maybe think about that in a different way than the literature typically does. Right.
Well, I
So,
think, in a way, I think this is when I look as an outsider, because I don't really do institutional theory, I don't do enterprise systems. So when I look at your body of PhD work, I would say like the contribution that you really made is you brought institutional logics into the IS field. ES implementation was your setting, and you showed that it was a useful way to look at ES implementation there, and it was a different way than what other people. Really, this is the contribution, not so much about how NASA handled its thing, right? So it wasn't really about the
yeah.
phenomenon; it's really about bringing this in.
Maybe, but so the whole point there is this, that if I had now, I don't think I think it was incremental, but the reason that people have told me they've liked that work that come from a non-institutional standpoint is that so much of our field is focused on things like adoption, task, technology fit. It's very individual level
Well, I used
or
to be at that time
individual
anyway.
task, right? Or at the time that I did.
Yeah.
And that, what my dissertation is arguing is what you're seeing that appears individual is always in an organizational context.
Yeah.
That organizational context has its different goals, its different institutions, right? In NASA, there was the institution of science. There was the government institution, right? There are all these institutions with their own goals, with their own trappings that are finding their way into these projects, and that people were motivated by differently in different institutional contexts and different games they were playing, right?
So
If you're a
would you say
government or
that
if you're a scientist.
like, I would say that since then the field has moved away a little bit from this individual level behavioral stuff, like attitude and trust and adoption and fit and stuff, to more to certainly to an econ level, but also to an organizational level, right? So would you say with that shift, we now see a bigger uptake on institutional theory because that lends itself to that theorizing and thinking about stuff on that level, because I think it does.
I think we do. The big thing that I see getting reviews. So there are two types of institutional theory that you get, right? The first is quantitative. And this is when they think of institutional theory as DiMaggio and Powell, which is mimetic, coercive, and they usually call them forces, right? Yep. Meanwhile, like mimetic is not a force, it's a behavior. So mimetic is imitation. Normative is, you're not being forced, but there are strong norms for doing certain things. And then coercive is you're being forced. The government is telling you to do this, right? And these are all four. So the DiMaggio and Powell, they were arguing with the rational view of organizational behavior, that organizations just do things rationally. They said, no, actually, there are these kind of non-technical rationality, like what's most efficient, right? And they're like, no, it's not always most efficient because, first of all, they have to comply with government agencies and do other things. That's coercive. And the idea of isomorphism is that all the firms start looking like each other. That's isomorphism, right? So because the government regulates them, that forces them to look like each other. Because there are certain norms in the professions and in the business schools and in the various, that they start doing the same thing. So although there's no external force forcing them to, they're just socialized into a context. So they all start looking like each other. And then mimetic, they're imitating each other. They're like looking at each other going, well, what should I do in this unknown situation? Let me just copy that other firm, right? So because of this, all firms start looking like each other, and organizations that aren't even for-profit firms start looking like for-profit firms, right? So that was DiMaggio and Powell's big argument. And then what people took that, the quantitative people did, is said, oh, there are these pressures to get them to do A, right? So then I measure mimetic, measure coercive, measure, and I do some statistical
variables from the outside influencing something.
Independent variables, right? So then you saw for a couple of decades a lot of surveys on mimetic, coercive, and then you saw after that, kind of more econometric analyses where they use proxy variables for these different things, right? So the quant people, that's what they think institutional theory is, right? Then from a very simplified level, right? And then the qualitative people have gotten really thrilled about logics lately. And the idea of a logic, I love the idea of a logic because it helps you navigate the big world that we all appeal to for our scripts, right? When I say scripts, we're like actors, right? This is Goffman. By the way, if anybody wants to read a social theorist who is not, you don't require a lot of baggage, you don't, and he's incredibly impactful. Read Irving Goffman, read The Presentation of Self in Everyday Life. It's about how we have our front space, our back space, and we're always enacting scripts. And it's one of the most powerful and easy to understand and simple sort of social theoretical that doesn't have a lot of baggage. But that's just it. We're always enacting these scripts. When I walk into a classroom and you walk into a classroom, if I'm the teacher and you're the professor, if I'm the teacher, you're the student, you know what to do. You go sit in one of the chairs.
Yeah.
If I'm the teacher, I know what to do. I go to the front, right? We all enact the things, at least the templates of all this behavior. So the beauty is that all these different fields, these institutions, and the government, the army, think about the family, these general institutions have their scripts for what you should do. When you go home, if you're the father, what do you do when you, and then you enact that, and you might adapt it your way, but that gives you the logic for your micro practices on an everyday basis.
And my wife would like that very much, because she always complains that I don't dress up appropriately enough. Like it should be a little bit more formal, because that is a script that is associated with a certain profession and a certain status and so forth. And so can't run around like Jan Mendling with hoodies all the time.
But you're wearing a hoodie right now.
Yeah, I know I am.
Yeah. Well, that's just it. You can break the script and you can do all kinds of things, but people, research this. But the beauty of that is you're attaching the big institution to the small practice, right? So I think it's very fruitful. It's Friedland and Alford is the classic paper in 1991, and people can find it online. But so it's captured the imagination. It enables people to navigate up and down from broad institutions down to specific activities and routines. And the problem there, when I get papers on institutional logics, is that people just use it as shorthand for logics and don't pay attention to the institutions. They're paying so much attention to these people are thinking this way, these people are thinking that way, and then they call it institutional logics. And I'm always like, well, where's the institution, right? The whole power of institutional logics is to say, well, really, it's this set of broader institutions playing out in the world, right? And their consistencies, their contradictions. And then when you just look at the logics, without attending to the institution, you've eliminated the broader.
In a way, what I'm hearing is exactly what I said about this little story about applying CAS, complex adaptive system, as an overarching grander theory overlying what we're doing. And I think a lot of people that now do institutional logic is the same thing. They say, oh my God, I want to do this one thing. And I know there's just this overarching, beautiful theoretical framework, institutional. Let's just grab that. I read 2 papers and I just apply that and use the terminology, right? And bring it in. But, I haven't really deeply engaged with this. And you see there's a lot in the papers because of stuff like that. They call it institutional logic, but there's nothing institutional about their logics. Or, of course, you notice that they're reinventing things that other people have said before. And thirdly, you often notice is when you ask them, what are you contributing back to institutional logics, right? So how is yours, what you're doing, not just an application, but really a contribution, right? And that's usually the telltale signs, I guess, of doing it. But again, this is what we have done, and we've done this ever since the beginning of the fields when we started taking TPB,
do you have to contribute back?
TRA and Eisen and Fishbein and just map the hell out of behavioral psychology to individual level behavior with technology. It's the same thing, right? This theory, not even adaptation, this theory application, bringing in the theory.
Yeah, it's because we're an applied discipline. We want to answer a question. And what is the question we want to answer?
That's
it's something
fine,
about.
But then we shouldn't ask them to make novel theoretical contribution. If we say, look, we applied it, it's good enough to solve a problem by applying this lens here. Why do I then have to go back and be better than DiMaggio and Powell? Why do I have to invent the fourth logic, even the fourth pressure? Why can't I just apply the 3 and say, like, look, it works?
Well, all 3 are not pressures, right? One's a process. It's a mimetic process. So that's another thing. They call them forces and pressures. They're not. Mimesis is a process. It's not a force or a pressure. So that's one of the little parsing when you're in the game. You're right.
Well, I beg to differ. There's a very important and influential paper by Seidel, Recker, and von Brocke about sense making. And one of the little things, there's a little section where we just introduced the setting, the case setting. Like, why did SAP start with that? Well, actually, there were at least 3 pressures. One of them
pressures you had? So you got it wrong too.
So, it's a little like an intro paragraph to the case setting or something, because it was so goddamn evident that they did this because someone told them to, the customer expected it or something. And then the third thing I forgot, but it was really just these institutional pressures left, right, and center. Like, the paper isn't about that, but it is in there somewhere, I think.
Well, here's what I would say. All right, so this is how to apply theory in a question, right? So this is your formula if you were to say be phenomenon driven. So let's say you wanted to write a paper and think about how the institutions play out when you're implementing blockchain in the developing world, right? So now you're phenomenon driven. You motivate yourself by saying blockchain is there's got to be something it's doing in the developing world, right? And then you problematize that, right? But there are challenges. What are those challenges? Well, there's an existing institutional order, right? So how do it exist? Maybe how do existing institutional actors get behind and co-opt blockchain? Local banks, local dictators, right? Whatever it is, right? How do they co-opt, right? So now the question is, how would they do that? Well, the first thing I would do is go look at the literature on how powerful actors co-opt new institutional arrangements, maybe institutional entrepreneurship and some of that stuff, right? You can't just assume what you're going to say now with blockchain is new. So now I would go and maybe I'd pick the conversation about institutional entrepreneurship and I would read it. And it started in the late 90s, early 2000s. And in the last 20 years, there's about, and all they use the term entrepreneurship. What they mean is a particular institutional actor. It could be a person, it could be an organization, does stuff that's different and changes the institution.
Exactly.
Kind of like Jan Mendling is now wearing a hoodie and he's doing so intentionally. Right. And now look, you're wearing a hoodie. And pretty soon professors all over Germany are going to wear hoodies so that they look like Jan Mendling, right?
Hey, he's the path creator.
What's that?
He's a path creator.
He's a path creator, right? Well, yeah, but he would be an institutional entrepreneur. That's how they call them, right? So now I would learn all of that. I would figure that out. And then I would use their constructs to see what I'm seeing in this developing country in blockchain and say, okay, what's happening? And then I would apply it. It's just applied. I'm not contributing anything. And then by applying it, I would say, am I observing anything different than people who study blockchain adoption?
So I don't disagree with you at all. And just in closing this, we've been going on for too long, and people will think like, what are these two old guys rambling about here? But just in wrapping this up, like, you're right, that's what we should be doing. But I also wager that all the PhD students, they're all thinking like, man, just Nick tells us to read more and deep. When am I going to do that? Like, I need to write, you can't do all of this. That's good scholarship, I agree. But it doesn't fit in a regime where we celebrate the person that writes 28 papers every year. How the hell are you going to do that? Yeah, if I do this, it'll literally take me a month or two to read up on that stuff. Because when I started studying blockchain, I wasn't thinking about Raghu Garuth, and certainly not about entrepreneurship, and certainly not about institution. Now you're saying, well, there is the connection. We need to study this, and we need to read this. It'll take a while.
It's a cumulative tradition, dude. I don't have any other answers. The only other thing you can do, so if you're willfully, because you claim to not have enough time, all right, I don't have any time, and I just spent all day yesterday reading about criticisms of econometrics, right?
I'm just saying,
you got to make time. There are two things you have to make time for if you claim to be a scholar. One is read stuff. The second is do reviews. I don't care how busy you are. Every week you should be doing reviews. You should be reading. All right,
we should do an episode on that. We should do strategies and tactics for reading or reviewing and staying on top of what people have said over the last 40 years. Maybe, these are the 10 books you should have read or whatever. The only thing I wanted to point out is I agree, this is scholarship, but it's not research productive.
You know what the other option is? Pick a method and be a really good methodologist. A lot of people, econometrics, and they take the data, it's analytical modelers, they're social network analysis people. They're not, you know enough theory to maybe write your dissertation if they need it, but just be really good in the method.
It's the same, like in my team in Hamburg, right? We started 1.5 years ago, and we all do field-based research. And I told them, look, guys, just beware. This doesn't scale well. You can't be super productive. You won't have a paper next year. It'll take a while when we go and find organization and spend time with them and observe them, etc. You can do this, and it's very meaningful and so forth. But, now a year later, everyone asks me, well, what's your recent paper? And I was like, I don't have any. Like, you got to wait another couple of years. Like, I have nothing to write about. We're not done, and obviously, so this sort of stuff takes more time. And now my team is realizing that I was actually right about this, right? And they're frustrated because they see everybody else writing 20 papers, 20 conference papers or something, whatever PhD students do these days. And they're like, oh my God, I should write 10 papers. I'm like, no, we have nothing
you could write 10 shitty conference papers. You could write 10 shitty conference papers without doing what I'm talking about. I mean,
but
you could just
if you write 10 shitty conference papers, you don't have the time to do what you just said.
So don't write 10 shitty conference papers, right? I mean, well, what's your goal? Is your goal to get a good quantity of what you want to say out into the world? Well, then, yeah, write 10 shitty conference papers and then send them to mid-level journals afterwards. And you can do that all day, and you can have 100. If you want to go to top tier publications, top tier outlets that value theory, the way that I know how to do it is you got to be steeped in a cumulative tradition, in a conversation, and you have to know what's happening, and then you have to extend it, right? And in our field, it typically means 2 conversations. And then it's really hard. There's no easy way, because someone's always going to look, like we talked about, I think, in a recent podcast, someone's going to look at what you wrote and say, oh, but this other field, psychology or economic, I already said this, right? And it's like,
yes, what I say about this comment from the reviewer in one of the seminars. What you just told me for an hour, Bruno Latour said in the 60s.
yeah. Except that I didn't read Bruno Latour in the 60s, and I don't want to. Yeah, but yeah. So,
Nick, we've been going on for too long.
Did we even have a point to this podcast today? What was it?
This is the
rambling.
We just needed to talk about this stuff episode.
All right. Did I at least change your mind? Do you think institutional theory is a little bit valuable?
I'm a bit of a jester, and I stab you a little bit because I know it pushes your button a little bit. But I will say this, over the last couple of years, probably because I moved more into org level phenomena, also, of course, because of, the influence with you, etc. And there's some really interesting stuff. I totally see how it's applicable. I really do see it, and some of that is really beautiful, and I didn't know it before, and I really didn't, right? You can't know everything, you can't read everything, so I do actually quite like it. I wouldn't go as far as ever becoming an institutional theory kind of guy, but I do like reading and working on this topic. But I'm very glad that you're there, so you can cover that angle, because I would make so many mistakes.
Well, I don't know about that.
Well, I enjoyed it. I'm pretty sure no one of the listeners, I don't think anyone will like this episode. I like this.
Is the worst.
This very, very much.
This is the worst episode we ever did.
Second worst.
What's the worst?
I don't know, but one's got to be worse than that.
There's got to have a worse one. The early ones where our volumes were all off and we weren't.
The most listened to episode still to this day is the very, very first. Do we need theory for impact science? Yeah, that's still.
We should listen to it. We should listen to that, because I haven't listened to it in 2 years or whatever. We should listen to that and then do another episode, the anniversary issue of theory.
The anniversary issue, yeah. We do exactly the anniversary episode. But I do think that, I don't know, it took us a while to get going. I think that's fair to say. All right, Nick, good talking to you.
All right, my brother. Later.